So now we turn to Jim, who is our urban forester. He works for the Virginia Department of Forestry, and he is absolutely the go-to person for all things trees in Northern Virginia. And we're very grateful. This is the second time he's done one of these Ask the Experts conferences. So Jim, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. All right, so today we are going to talk about selecting and planting trees. And as soon as there we go. And I need to arrange a few things here so that I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so as Margaret said, my name is Jim McGlone. I'm an urban forest conservationist with the Virginia Department of Forestry, and we're going to talk today about selecting and planting trees. Before we get into talking about how to select or plant a tree, I wanted to share this picture with you. This is a diagram from the Morton Arboretum in Naperville, Virginia, or Naperville, Illinois. This is what trees want to look like. So if you put a seed in the ground and grow a tree for long enough, this is what it's going to try and look like. Obviously, in Northern Virginia, it's going to run into houses and streets and things, so you're not going to get this nice disc of roots, but you will get that volume of roots. And the volume of the roots is equal to or greater than the volume of the canopy, but where the canopy is sort of a three-dimensional, sort of a dome shape, the roots are better described as a disc about 20 inches deep. So most of that root mass is going to want to be in the top of the soil. And that's something that's very important to understand, and most people don't think about when they are selecting trees. So if you're going to plant a tree in your yard, the first step is to select a species. And that means getting the right tree in the right place. And when you are looking or thinking about species, you've got two basic questions. What species will grow in my yard? What species will fit in my yard? Now, unfortunately, a lot of people don't think about that second question. So in answering those questions, you think about there are these considerations. And this should be really the way you are thinking about the order in which you address this. So the first thing, of course, is climate. You don't want to try and grow, say, Lignum vitae, which is native to the Florida Keys and the Caribbean. Probably not going to do well in our climate, at least not for quite a long time. Similarly, we have a moist, temperate climate, so you don't want to grow a tree that is native to a cold, dry climate, like a spruce, or which is why Colorado spruces, although they will grow here for a while, tend to have problems. The next most important question is that rooting space, which is why I showed you that diagram. Obviously, in a thing like this, which is called a parking lot island, arborists call these tree coffins. They put two plane trees in here, or sycamores. They are not going to reach maturity. They simply don't have enough soil available to them to do that. The general rule is you need 1.5 cubic feet of soil for every square foot of canopy. The other thing to look at then is overhead wires. It's not a good idea to plant a big tall tree under your power lines. The power company is going to come in and eventually start pruning that to make sure they have clearance for those overhead wires. Keep in mind, the overhead wires are the ones at the top of the pole. Those bigger, heavier wires lower down on the pole are communications. That's where your cable and your telephone go, and those are not affected by trees. The other thing that people forget about is clearance. You need to think about what shape that tree is going to have when it matures. You want to be sure that the canopy is not going to be interfering with sidewalks or driveways or streets, because for some trees like pin oaks, you're going to have a constant pruning problem with them. Underground utilities, people ask me about this all the time, and pretty much what will happen is the trees will simply avoid or go around those underground utilities. The one exception is the sewer lateral that runs from your house to the sewer main out in the street. You are responsible for that. If you have an older house, it may be made from a material that's going to eventually fail. That can create a big or need to do a big trench through your front yard, although there are ways to replace them without trenching. But that could be a consideration. Most of the rest of them are not going to be an issue. It's more an issue of installing underground utilities around established trees. And finally, think about your soil type and your moisture. Moisture is particularly important. If you've got a spot in your yard that has surface water for days after every rainstorm, that may be an issue. But for the most part, it's not, soil type and moisture is not going to be an issue in your yard. When we go out into nature, one of the misconceptions about trees is that they grow where they get the resources they need. And most trees grow where they have a competitive advantage in dealing with site stress. So this is a picture I took in Florida of bald cypress growing in standing water. The reason bald cypress grows in standing water is not because it needs a lot of water, it's because it can grow in standing water and the other trees can't. So it can outcompete any trees where you have standing water. So think about, would be sort of what we see here in Northern Virginia. The gray part is bedrock. The brown stuff is soil. All the trees want to grow at mid-slope. This is where you have the deep, rich, moist, well-drained soil that all the trees like. But that's a pretty crowded neighborhood if all the trees were growing there. So some of them have learned to move up and deal with stressors you find either at the top of the hill or the bottom of the hill. At the top of the hill, because of gravity, you tend to have thin, dry, and fertile soils. Gravity is pulling soil down, but in particular, it's pulling clay and organic matter. That's what holds the moisture and nutrients in the soil. So your soils up here are poorer. Down at the bottom of the hill, you have very thick soils, but they tend to stay saturated, so you have a low oxygen environment. And the tree roots need the oxygen, so that's another stressor. One of the issues we run into in Northern Virginia is when we develop, we tend to strip off the topsoil and then compact the subsoil. Well, stripping off that topsoil leaves you with a dry and fertile site. Compacting the subsoil leaves you with a low oxygen site. And while there are trees that do well with low oxygen, they generally don't do well with dry and fertile sites. Similarly, trees that grow well in dry and fertile sites don't do as well in these low oxygen sites. So we run into the problem that we really don't have many trees that are adapted or ideally suited to the soils we have. Like, keep in mind, this distribution in nature is driven by competition. So when you're planting a tree in your front yard, you are taking it away from competition. So it doesn't have to compete with the other trees. Bottom line is that pretty much all of the trees that are native to Northern Virginia will grow in your yard. They may not do, some species may do a little bit better than others, but they're all going to grow. And they're all going to be stressed because of what we do to the soils when we build. All right, so you've selected a tree or a species. You've got a species that'll grow here. It's the right size for your yard. Now you go to the nursery, and what you're confronted with is lots of different sizes, lots of different protection methods, and you got to figure out which tree of that species you're going to bring home and plant in your yard. One of the things that most people don't think about when they are planting a tree is aftercare. And in general, the larger the tree is at planting, the longer you're going to need to give it extra care until it gets established in your site. Production method has different stressors on the tree, but it still winds up being the same. So this is a 1-inch caliper tree that you buy at the nursery. You plant the tree on a Saturday, you need to water it daily. Give it a gallon of water every day for the next 6 weeks. And then every other day for the rest of the growing season. If it's a 2-inch caliper tree, then it becomes 8 weeks of watering and 2 years of every other day watering. So that's what I mean by aftercare. Think about how much effort you want to put into taking care of that newly planted tree. And so this is from Ed Gilman at the University of Florida. He killed a lot of trees to learn this information, and what it comes down to is the smaller the size tree you get or transplant, the faster it will establish, which means a shorter irrigation period. It will become drought or flood susceptible, because if you plant a drought tolerant species, it won't be drought tolerant until it is established in the site. And they're cheaper, and because of phenotypical responses, that is, the phenotype of the tree is how it responds to environmental cues. Well, the longer it is at the nursery, the more locked in it gets into a phenotype that may not be appropriate for your landscape. So the shorter time it spends at the nursery, the more adaptable it's going to be to your particular site. Again, small stock does much better than the larger stock in everything except the pruning needs. They do a lot of structural pruning on those larger trees at the nursery, mainly so they look pretty and will sell faster. You may have to do some of that pruning yourself, but that's a small price to pay. When I say it has high pruning, we say it has high pruning needs, we're talking about going out maybe for the first 5 years or so and making 2 or 3 cuts per year. So it's not a lot of work, but you need to know what you're doing. Just to reinforce the fact that those smaller sized trees will eventually get bigger than or as big as the larger stock. On the left here is a crabapple that I paid $50 for and planted in 2004. On the right is a northern red oak that a squirrel planted in 2006. All I had to do was not pull it up when it sprouted. And as you can see, by 2018, that little northern red oak that grew from a seed is now bigger than the crabapple. Because what happens is the smaller stock trees are going to establish and start growing tops faster than those larger trees. So that's something to think about when you decide to bring one home. If you want more information, you can search tree care, ufl.edu. That's one site. This is where Ed Gilman put together a lot of his research that he did at the University of Florida. One of the big issues we have with nursery stock trees or nursery trees is bad roots. This is again from Gilman's site. This tree had been in the ground for 5 years, and as you can see, it never got out of its root ball. All of the structural roots are circling. One of the things that's of some concern is this was probably the original root plate of this tree. It may have been transplanted to a larger pot and planted deep, and so it grew adventitious roots here. Then transplanted yet again and planted deep and developed a root collar up here. But all of this part of the tree is actually supposed to be above ground and part of the trunk rather than part of the root system. So it's really important when you're buying a tree at the nursery that you look at the roots. You should take some kind of a probe, something like a knitting needle, or if you use a skewer, be careful because they can have points. But you want to probe into that root ball and find this trunk flare, find where that first root occurs. Now, this diagram uses trunk flare. Another term you may hear is root flare. They're the same thing. That's that point where the trunk becomes roots or the roots become trunk. If you're looking from the top down, it's the trunk flare. If you're looking from the bottom up, it's the root flare. You want to look for, I mean, it is important. You should be looking for good upper structure, but the bottom line is here, this can be fixed a lot easier than these root problems. So if you see these little roots coming out of the weep holes of the pot, you see a lot of weeds growing in the pot. Those are all indications that the tree has been in the pot a long time. You should, before you buy the tree, take it out of the pot and look at the roots. If you see these large roots out at the edge that are circling, you don't want to buy that tree. That's very hard to fix. If you got fine absorbing roots that are kind of brown or white out near the edge of the tree, they should be brown. If they are all white, that's an indication of anoxia in the root ball. That's not a good thing. If they're black, that means those roots are dead. So you want to look for those. And I'll show you a picture of a good looking root system for one of these container trees. But you should pull it out of the container and look at it before you take it home. If the nursery objects, go someplace else. All right. You've selected a good species, you've selected a good tree, now you're going to take it home and you're going to plant. There are two important things that you need to do or keep in mind when you are planting the tree. The first is you set that root flare at existing grade. And nothing comes out of or goes in the planting hole but the tree, the water, and the soil that came out of it. And that's so important, I'm going to repeat it. Nothing goes in the planting hole but the tree, the water, and the soil that came out of it. You do not mix anything into your backfill soil, period. I don't care. I've heard all of these complaints and issues, and anytime you do that, you make your drainage problems worse because you're changing the texture of the soil and creating a hydrological discontinuity between your planting hole and the surrounding soil. So the way this works is you bring your tree home, you expose the top of the root flare by removing any of the excess soil or growing medium from the ball. Frequently when they're digging trees in the field, they will add soil on the top to make that ball. You want to make sure that you expose that root flare, and so now you know how big your augmented ball is. Then you dig a hole at the depth of that augmented ball and about twice as wide. Once you have that hole there, you should create a pedestal by digging around the outside edge of the hole, making it a little deeper there. You should also rough up the edges of the hole because as your shovel goes through it, particularly in these subsoils that we're usually dealing with, you can glaze the hole and make it hard for water to move in and out. So rough it up to create so that you don't have a smooth glazed plane there that's preventing water from moving. Take off the ropes, take off the wire basket and the burlap, or remove the container. Now, I know a lot of places are going to say, well, pull the basket and the burlap back about 1/3. There's this huge debate about natural versus art or synthetic burlap. there's a complaint that if you take the burlap and the basket off, the root ball will fall apart. None of that makes any sense to me. That basket and the burlap are planting material. Nobody ever says just remove the top third of the container. You take the container off completely, take off all the planting material and get packaging material and get rid of it. All those things are going to do is potentially get in the way of this tree growing roots. It's hard enough to be a tree in Northern Virginia, in a Northern Virginia suburban yard, without having to deal with this other stuff. Put the tree in the hole and plumb it up so that it's nice and straight. This is where it's handy to have a helper who can look at it from a couple of different angles and make sure that root flare is at soil level. One trick that I always use is I lay my shovel handle down across the planting hole and I bring the root flare up to the bottom edge of the shovel. That's going to get my root flare at the right level. Then refill that hole. You can tamp lightly or fill it about 1/2 to 3/4 of the way and settle it by putting a lot of water in the hole. The idea here is you want to make sure you don't have any large air pockets, but you do want to have macro pores, so you don't want to stomp on this backfill material and compact it. So just tamp it down lightly, make sure you get all the big air pockets out of it. Once it's completely full, you can settle it again by putting some water in there. And again, nothing goes into the hole but the soil that came out and water. Then take your pruners. If you have dead or broken branches, prune those off. Remove all of the tags and anything else attached to the trunk of the tree. There's some sites that will tell you to, prune for the central leader or crossing branches. Only do that if you are never going to come back to this tree. But if you are planting it in your yard, leave that stuff alone. The tree needs sugar, which means those competing leaders and those crossing branches are going to be producing the sugar that the tree needs to get established. Once it's established, you can come back and deal with those structural issues. Water it well if you haven't already. Then you can mulch with 3 to 4 inches or even up to 6 inches of arborist chips. Those are the things that come off of the arborist truck. They're actually pretty easy to get hold of. There is an app in Virginia called chipdrop.com that you can sign up for. One thing to be aware of is usually what you wind up with is a whole truckload of chips. If you don't want to deal with a whole truckload of chips, you can get the shredded hardwood mulch and do it about 2 to 3 inches deep. The difference is the arborist chips are uncomposted, so they are still very rough. They're going to create a lot of pore space that's going to allow water and oxygen to get into the soil under them. If you are using a more commercial mulch, do not use the triple shredded mulch that has really fine pieces, because that's on its way to becoming paper. What will happen is that stuff will lock together and create a mat in your landscape that you're going to have to constantly break up. And it's going to shed water, and it's going to be a vapor barrier that's going to keep oxygen from getting into the soil. When you're putting your mulch in, don't put it up against the trunk of the tree. And as far as the width, we don't have any science that says how far it should be, but certainly at least to the width of the planting hole, ideally to about 6 foot diameter on a newly planted tree. And that should keep expanding as the tree gets bigger, because you get 5 times more tree root mass under that mulch than you will under turf. So this is what it looks like. Here's the idea of partially filling in and settling the soil. There's your little pedestal by making it deeper. Notice the edges have been roughed up. And notice here, unamended backfill soil, no peat, no bark, no sand, no gravel, no whatever you're thinking of putting in that soil. If you're worried that it's not fertile enough and you want to give it, put a little mulch down or a little compost down under the mulch, that might be fine. However, keep in mind, it is possible to over fertilize a tree. And notice this diagram comes from 1995. It was produced by our agency along with Virginia Tech Extension. If you were going to stake your tree, make sure the stakes are outside of the planting hole and certainly outside of the ball. The reason to stake is because the tree is not firm in the ground. But when you do the staking, keep in mind, notice this picture, it's really easy to see. See how the tree begins to taper starting about here and gets thicker as it goes down? That's because this area right here, towards the base of the tree, above the root plate, but at the base of the trunk, is what's called the bending moment. This is where, when the tree sways in the breeze, that is the maximum stress point. Well, that stress causes the tissues to grow more wood fiber and strengthen the tree there. So it's really important that that tree be able to sway, even with the stakes. Not enough that it'd fall over, but that it gets some backward and forward movement. So make sure the guys are taut, but not restrictive. As soon as the tree is firm in the ground, take the guys off. After 1 year, take the guys off. If the tree is not still firm in the ground, you probably need to pull it out of the ground and replant it, because that means the roots have never gotten out of the root ball. And the way you test for firmness is grab hold of the tree at the top and wiggle it. If you see the tree flexing and bending, but the soil remains stable, it's firm. If it's still rocking back and forth, then it's not firm and it's not ready to be unguyed. Now, I talked about the root issues. This is actually a pretty healthy root system, but notice the color first of all, and notice that the roots have reached the edge of the container and are starting to circle. Now, there are some people who will tell you what you need to do is butterfly this root ball. That is, grab it at the base and rip the sides up. Other people say you should take your little Japanese Ginsu planting knife and make vertical slits around the ball. Well, we tested that, and that doesn't really make any difference. What does make a difference is this process of squaring the circle. Now you're going to watch, I know you're going to watch this and you're going to be horrified by all the roots that we're cutting off of this tree. Keep in mind, trees constantly grow and shed these fine roots. They're putting as much of this fine root mass in the soil as is coming down out of the canopy during the leaf fall. So you take a sharp implement, sharp shovel, if it's small enough, your little Ginsu planting knife or a saw. If your significant other is a woodworker, do not use their good crosscut saw. It will dull it, and that's going to create friction between you and the woodworker. You'll want to slice all the way down to the ground and cut that piece off and keep rotating it until you have sliced off all of the outside edges of that ball. This obviously is a pentagon, but pentagoning the circle doesn't sound quite as nice as squaring the circle. And then you go ahead and plant it. I would point out, you want to remove this wrap. This is put on there to protect the trunk during transport. It's, again, packaging material that doesn't belong on the tree. So that's the way we do it now, but we've only done it that way for about 80 years. Back in the day, we used to get trees either as bare roots. We weren't shipping lots of soil around with the trees. You would get your tree in wet mulch. And some arborists have started Actually, it's been about 10 or 15 years, and the science that's been done has shown that this is actually a better way to plant a tree than the way we've been doing it for the past 80 years. So with root washing, you're treating the container, the burlap, the basket, and the soil in the root ball. This is part of the reason I'm not all that concerned about taking the basket and the burlap off of those balled and burlap trees, and then the root ball falls apart. So what I'm actually advocating that you purposely destroy the root ball and get rid of that soil. It's different than what's in your yard. It's going to create some hydrological problems. Treat it all as packaging and discard it. If you buy bare root trees, make sure you get all that hydrogel off of the root system. I have heard that this stuff will absorb water from whatever source it can find it. And if there's no moisture in the soil, it'll take it out of the tree roots. That also makes it hard for the trees to get water from the soil and from this stuff. So it can create a problem for your roots. You're going to dig a wide, shallow hole about 1 spade blade deep. So it's not as deep as the hole that you've dug. And if you've ever tried to dig a hole for a tree, especially a larger tree, you know how hard it can be to dig in that compacted subsoil. Once you have removed the soil from the root ball, you can spread out the roots. And keep in mind that if you're doing this with a containerized tree, you may lose a lot of that root mass because that stuff in the container is not soil. And sometimes the roots will actually grow through the little bits of bark and stuff in there and make it hard to get rid of that stuff. If you can't spread some of the roots or some of the roots are dead, you can take a nice sharp pair of bypass pruners and prune those off. If you need to, widen the hole to accommodate that root spread. But if you have one root that runs about 4 feet, you can go ahead and cut that with your sharp bypass pruner. Cover the roots with soil and mud in. And what that means is the first time I saw this demonstrated, they actually took the hose and turned it on about half flow and just started jabbing the end of the hose into the backfill soil to turn it into a slurry. If you don't have a hose, you can use a bucket of water. Be careful when you're pouring it in that you're not washing the soil out of your planting hole. And so what you wind up with is something that looks like this. And if you'll notice, this looks a whole lot more like the root system of the tree that I showed you at the beginning than the root systems from those containerized trees. So the roots are being spread out in the soil the way they're supposed to. The other thing is, because you're putting the roots out like this, it's going to be firmer in the soil, because when you've got a containerized tree or balled and burlap tree and you put it in the ground, it's sort of like the your shoulder joint, where the humerus goes into the pectoral girdle, which is a ball and socket. And if you just take your arm and start moving it around, if you can, you'll see how much motion you get there. And now imagine if that was a flat connection. So there are a lot of advantages to this. The tree is lighter and easier to handle. One of the #1 injuries is in the landscaping and arboricultural industry is lower back injury from moving trees around. You can see and correct those root problems. You get the roots properly oriented in the soil. The mudding in is going to get the soil close to the roots and provide plenty of water. You're usually going to be firmer. It doesn't need to be staked, and you're going to get that taper starting to develop immediately. Here are some good online resources for information. ISA is the International Society of Arboriculture. This is all science-based information that they're putting out. If you're looking for so Trees Are Good is a good online source for all of this, as well as the Tree Owners Manual, the National Tree Benefit Calculator, if you want to figure out what benefits you're getting from the tree. Um, Fairfax County has some good information on them. And if you're looking for an arborist, goodtreecare.com is a good source. If you are looking for trees or shrubs for your yard, and you're looking for particularly smaller specimens, starting tomorrow for $17, you can get 8 bare root seedlings of these species from the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. The ordering starts tomorrow. You should order online. Keep in mind that last year this sold out in about 3 days. So if you want these trees, you better get cracking tomorrow morning and get in there and order them. This year, they are not going to be selling any trees the day of, so you do need to order beforehand. Anything that doesn't get picked up or anything that's left over from their stock is going to go to reforestation projects here in Fairfax County. The one thing I would say, these are, as I said, small bare root seedlings, so you're getting the whole tree. So that whole thing about watering doesn't apply to these bare root seedlings. These you might have to give a gallon of water, although if the rain keeps falling the way it has been, you won't even need to do that. Give them a gallon of water when you plant them. If we go 2 weeks without rain during this calendar year, give them another gallon of water. Otherwise, they should be pretty much good to go because they're going to establish very quickly in the land. And you can just search on NVSWCD seedling sale to get more information about this. This is who I am. I will put up those slides while we do questions and answers. Margaret mentioned that we got some pictures. This is one of the pictures we received. And what I really like is the north arrow. So I know what direction I'm looking at. And I'm looking at a slope that is sort of east or just north of east. And what that tells me is this is going to be a wetter slope or a moister slope than if this was south or west facing, because you get less evaporation going on these east facing and north facing slopes. And then they pointed out having this picture or this tree in the picture, excuse me, let me know that these are white oaks. So as we transition into questions, let me put this back up for you to begin with. And we got a bunch of questions beforehand. So I will deal with that. And Margaret, if you can sort of, while I'm answering the early questions, if you can look and see if anything's popped up in the chat box.
I will.
We'll get to those. So the first question we got is about white oaks. And they have been struggling lately, but the larger, older, mature oaks have been dying from something called oak decline syndrome. This is a combination of environmental stressors as well as which then get compounded with biotic stressors, things like root rot or insects, and causes them to eventually die. Keep in mind that we're generally looking at trees that are in the 50, 60, 75-year-old age range. So I would still go ahead and plant the white oaks. You know, if you're still going to be here in 70 years, more power to you. But there's still a really good species for Northern Virginia. And if you really want to find out more about what's been killing them, I did a program with the Fairfax County Urban Forest Management Division on oak decline syndrome, which can be found at fairfaxcounty.gov/publicworks/trees/news, videos and podcasts. So if you just go to Fairfax County UFMD and start clicking through there, you should find where they have their podcasts under their forest health. There were several questions about tree selection. One of them was understory shrubs that are deer resistant, or just said understory shrubs and deer resistant. And I don't know if they want deer resistant shrubs or they're looking for shrubs and plants that are deer resistant. In either case, there's a lot of good information on the Plant Nova Natives website on those. This one person said they want to plant a small native tree in our small front yard. They sent the picture. It's actually not that small front yard, but it's sunny and dry with a slight decline leading to the sidewalk. It's actually one of those south-facing slopes. And they were thinking about an Appalachian spring dogwood or a flowering dogwood. So first of all, Appalachian spring dogwood is a cultivar of flowering dogwood. Appalachian spring is a natural expression of the flowering dogwood genome. It's the genetic material came from some flowering dogwoods that survived an outbreak on Catoctin Mountain of anthracnose. However, a south-facing slope in full sun is a horrible place to plant Cornus florida. That's our native flowering dogwood. I would not recommend that species for that site. So when I said any native tree will grow in your yard, you do need to pay attention to sun, shade, particularly. The dogwoods get really stressed in the full sun. They tend to get powdery mildew, and a bunch of other leaf diseases. If you're looking to attract wildlife, redbud, black haw, even black willow, which most people don't realize are pollinator plants. They are pollinated by bees. So they're a good plant to have in your landscape, willows in general, for that early morning. You might even consider putting in a couple of American hornbeams, which are not going to flower, but then putting some of our native shrubs under those hornbeams that will provide the flower and the wildlife value that you don't get out of the hornbeams. The next question was about chestnut hybrids. As far as I know, there's really only one American chestnut hybrid, which is from or the only one I'd recommend would be to get seeds or seedlings from the American Chestnut Foundation. As far as suited to Northern Virginia, if you're in the Piedmont or the mountains, yeah, you probably have a good place for them. I wouldn't plant chestnuts in the coastal plain, or if you're in the lowlands in particularly Loudoun County. That's not where they're native to. The next, and there were two questions there. The other thing is, if you can hold off and you really want an American chestnut, I would say 7 to 10 years from now, you can get you could probably get chestnuts that are American chestnut that are blight resistant, that are being produced at Cornell. They're about 2 years away from regulatory approval, and then they need to ramp up production to get them out into the landscape. The second part of the question is about hypoxylon canker. Hypoxylon is a genus, and they have actually changed it to an unpronounceable, given it an unpronounceable name. It's a genus of fungi that are native to, as far as I know, all over North America, but specifically in Northern Virginia. And they are ubiquitous. Pretty much every tree has hypoxylon spores in it. This is one of those things, it's pretty much the grim reaper of trees. So this moves in when your tree is mostly dead. There is really no effective way to control it because it is so ubiquitous, but it's only going to affect really, really badly stressed trees. So I mentioned oak decline syndrome. Pretty much the last thing that comes into those trees before they die is hypoxylon. So the tree is mostly dead by the time the hypoxylon becomes evident. But there are hypoxylons for every species of tree. What tree works best in clay soil? Well, again, as I said, pretty much all of the trees that are native to Northern Virginia are going to grow in your yard, regardless of your soil type. Some trees will grow a little bit better than others, but most of them will grow on clay soil. The next question is best distance to plant oaks from a large drainage ditch. Depends on the species. If it's one of those upland species that's adapted to growing up on the ridge line that I talked about, I wouldn't put those too close to a drainage ditch. On the other hand, we do have oaks like pin oaks, willow oak, swamp white oak, swamp chestnut oak, water oak. Those things are all adapted to growing in wet sites, so putting them close to a drainage ditch would be okay. It also depends on what kind of a drainage ditch. Keep in mind, you don't want to put it too close and have that root plate break up the concrete if it's a line ditch. But if it's a dirt ditch, I wouldn't worry too much if it's one of those riparian species, riparian oaks. What trees can you plant on an abandoned septic field? This ties in with another question about septic fields that we got later, that came in later. Where is that? So you don't want to plant any trees on an active septic field. On an abandoned septic field, they're all going to love it there because you probably have pretty good nutrition and pretty good aeration and pretty good water in that abandoned septic field, just because you've been pumping a lot of fertilizer and a lot of good stuff that trees like into that field while it was in use. So I would say pretty much anything, if it's already partially shaded, then you want to go with a tree that can take some shade. So it's the shading, not the septic field, that's the consideration. All right, this is another person who's looking for advice on smaller trees and shrubs. They're going to be planting again. This is under maples, poplars, and a dead ash tree. Well, where the dead ash tree is, you might be able to plant something that's a little more shade intolerant, but under those, you're probably going to be looking at our small shade tolerant trees. And I was just looking at the page on the Plant Nova Natives website today, and it's got lots of good advice for native trees that can take shade. This person is looking for best affordable options for trees within a community that do not require intense amount of watering. And if there are any drought tolerant xeriscaping without use of stone. Well, you don't need to use stone in xeriscaping. I would say based on, it sounds like you want to plant and forget. And so what you're looking for are bare root seedlings that would be appropriate based on your sun requirements. Certainly, I would say that all of the trees and shrubs that are being offered by the Soil and Water District would fit into that category. What native tree would be good for a small townhouse yard? And then they ask if the hybrid dogwood, such as Rutgers red pygmy, would be beneficial in any way? And is there a lilac to plant? So red pygmy is not a hybrid. Red pygmy is a selection. It is a straight Cornus florida. My only concern is the red brax. I'm not sure how that's going to interact with our native pollinators. The bees probably do not find that as useful because bees don't see red. So any red flowers look black and dead to bees. So you may be attracting other pollinators. If you can find a white dogwood, that would certainly be an idea. One of the other things you might consider is, for example, the Ace of Hearts redbud, which is a small redbud cultivar. It really depends on how much space, on how much sun you're getting in that yard as to which of these. A lot of the tree cultivars that are small, all they've done is they have selected and reproduced vegetatively trees that for some reason didn't, their expression of the native genome does not allow them to get bigger, but there have been no intensive breeding programs. The Ace of Hearts redbud is Cercis canadensis. It's just one that doesn't get very big. What native trees grow quickly? Again, I would refer you to the Plant Nova Natives website, but right off the top of my head, I would say sycamore, river birch. Shortleaf pine grows pretty quick. Once it gets established, it won't do much the first year or two, but then it'll take off and run. Actually, the rate at which they grow depends a lot on where they are planted and how much sun they're getting. So even some of the oaks that are not competing, that are in full sun, will grow pretty quickly, even though they are reputed to be slow growers. Of course, the champion is tulip poplar and red maple. I don't really recommend either of those for yards, but that's their, tulip poplar in particular, that's their adaptation for taking over those good sites. Another tree for a small site and won't branch out after 12 to 15 feet. All of the trees are going to have branches when they're low, below 12 to 15 feet, when they're young. As they get older and the crown and they get more of their crown above that, they will start losing those branches. So you will have to prune them somewhat, so that this person actually has a large rhododendron and camellia that they don't want them growing into. So, my recommendation would be plant whatever you want there. They are also trying to block a two-story house next door, so at least American hornbeam, but you're probably going to have to do some pruning when it's young to keep it from interfering with that rhododendron and camellia. This is the other question. They have a septic field that's surrounded by poorly maintained woodlot. They're clearing out the invasives. They want to plant natives in the area. It's hard for me to make a recommendation on that because I don't know exactly where this site is. I don't know what the sun characteristics are, but I would recommend, again, Plant Nova Natives has lots of good recommendations for shrubs and things. If the trees are on the north side of the septic field or the east side, they're probably going to get a lot of, on the north side, they'll get full sun all day. On the east side, they'll get afternoon sun. On the west side, they'll get morning sun. So you need to take that into consideration when you're figuring out what you want to plant in these woods. If it's on the south side, they are going to get, they're going to get a lot of shade. So you need something that's pretty shade tolerant. And the last question that I got beforehand is looking for native trees in Virginia that attract birds and wildlife, flower, and do not grow too tall. There aren't a whole lot of flowering tree, small flowering trees. Most of these things we think of are shrubs, but again, I would point you to Plant Nova natives. So one of the things you could be looking at would be a serviceberry, a dogwood, a redbud, black haw, which is generally considered a shrub, but I've seen them as big or bigger than dogwoods, as well as all of the other viburnums that are native to the area, shrub dogwoods, buttonbush. So there are a lot of things that will attract birds and wildlife that don't get too big and will fit that bill. Let's see. And Margaret, you said there were a couple new ones that you emailed to me. Last two questions. Oh, Carolina silverbell. Will the Carolina silverbell do well in Fairfax County? What I read is that it prefers slightly cooler climates. So this would be one that's really right on the edge of the growing range. For Fairfax County is on the growing range. This is a plant that's native to places like Great Smoky Mountains, the higher Piedmont areas of Western North Carolina into Western Virginia, where it doesn't get quite as much coastal effect from the Gulf Stream as we do here in Fairfax County. So I would say it's a little marginal for this area. It's not native to Fairfax County, and it's probably going to become increasingly marginal as things get warmer. And the other question was, I need to replace a red oak with bacterial leaf scorch. Should the bacterial leaf scorch in the present tree affect my decision as to what tree to place to replace it? And the answer is probably not. If you practice good hygiene, that is, make sure you rake up all of those affected leaves and get them out of there. You're going to be removing the spores, but bacterial leaf scorch can affect a whole lot, a lot of different species. So it's one of those things that's out there in the environment, and you're just going to have to manage your tree and pay attention to it. The red oaks tend to be more susceptible to bacterial leaf scorch than the white oak. So that would be more of just looking around for trees that are less susceptible to it. And if you're out on the internet looking for that, I would strongly recommend that you, when you do your search, end with .edu, because then you're going to be getting science-based information rather than just all of that vampire stuff out there on the internet that we've been trying to kill for a long time. So that's the end of the early questions that we received.
All right, we have several new questions. So the first one was, should we or do you need to water new trees that were planted in the late fall or early winter?
You should give them some water if we have a really dry winter. They don't need as much as the ones that are planted in the spring, because what they are, because what's using up most of the water is photosynthesis and transpiration. So it's really important to water them during the growing season. They don't need as much water, but if we have a really weird fall or winter where we get no snow, no rain, you do need to water them a little bit, because the roots, part of the reason for planting in the fall is that although the top of the tree is dormant, the roots that are down in the warmer soil are not dormant, and they are going to be growing, and they are going to need some water there, at least to bring nutrients into the tree.
Okay. Now, do I understand correctly that you were saying that if it's bare root, you put a gallon of water on once, and then you don't need to really water unless there's like a drought or something?
Yeah. So if you had planted in 2019, you wouldn't have needed to water in the spring of 2019. You wouldn't have needed to water those trees until Uh, until about July 23rd, because we had, if you remember, July 8th, 2019, we had that 1,000-year storm. And then it just quit raining after that. So 2 weeks after that would be about July 23rd, and we'd start to be getting the topsoil was starting to dry out a little bit. And that's when you would need to add the water. And then every 2 weeks through August and September, because that was really bad. But if we get rain, even our normal rainfall in July and August, they really don't need to be watered.
Okay, so only if you go more than 2 weeks without rain in the summer.
Yep.
Okay. All right, here's a question. If the seedlings are quite small, is it okay to plant in a pot for the first year and leave outdoors?
Yes, you can do that. And then keep in mind everything that I said about transplanting when you get ready to take them out of the pot and put them into the ground. I would strongly recommend, because that pot probably going to have, unless you're putting soil from your yard into the pot, you probably don't want to use that potting soil in your planting hole, because it's going to have a different texture than what we have here in Northern Virginia, and you're going to create that hydrological discontinuity. So when you take it out of the pot, try and get all the soil off of it before you put it into the ground.
Okay. What are the best ways to get advice on where to plant trees in our yard, such as, for instance, a visit from Jim or Master Gardeners Naturalists?
Master gardeners, probably, rather than master naturalists. It's not really something we train the master naturalists for. This information that, if I'm not mistaken, you can still see up on your screen. Trees Are Good is a great reference. If you want something, if you're old school and you want something you can hold on to, you can get the Tree Owner's Manual and print it out. This, by the way, if you have a group or an organization, the Forest Service created this Tree Owner's Manual and purposely did not copyright it. It's a free use document. They never printed a single copy themselves. The idea was for tree stewards or tree commissions or local governments or HOAs should print this out. You can even work with them to get your logo on it for distribution. It's out there in the public for anybody to use. Fairfax County also on their tree website, they have a tree basics. I know I have to say that because I saw Gene, who worked really hard on updating that, is on the call. It's also a local publication that gives you a lot of good information about taking care of your trees.
Okay.
But you can also go to contact me. That's my job. I don't make that many site visits. Keep in mind, there is me for all of the, 1.3 million people in Fairfax and Arlington. So getting out to do site visits is something that I only do when I have a lull in my schedule, or you are describing something really interesting that I want to come out and look at. Most of the time, I'm going to explain what I'm seeing and then recommend that you get a certified arborist to take care of it.
Is it convenient for someone to send you a photo with a little arrow on it?
Yes.
Points north?
Yeah, it would be, and give me your address, because that will let me know where the site is. Whether you're in the coastal plain, the Triassic Basin, or the Piedmont.
And there's an urban forester in every jurisdiction, I think.
You can call the local urban foresters, but because of some really weird stuff in state code, they can't give you much help on private property. I, on the other hand, can come to your property and give you advice.
Okay. All right, hold on a second. I lost my place. Okay. How would you handle transplanting small trees? I have clients with volunteer tree seedlings throughout their landscapes that could be moved rather than just weeded out. Are there some best practices that could be used for transplanting some of those native trees? Root ball size, remove the soil, keep on, maximum size you would consider for transplant?
The maximum size I would consider, well, in theory, if you're willing to put in the time, you can transplant any size tree. I have seen pictures of 36-inch diameter trunks, trees with trunks that big that have been successfully transplanted. There are not many people who know how to do that because, as you can imagine, the root ball for a tree that big is huge. So the root ball is going to be proportionate to the size of the tree. Keep in mind that picture that I showed you. It's going to start developing that kind of a root system, even at the nursery. As a seedling, I've got a picture of a red maple that has a spreading root system like that must be 2 feet in length. It got compressed because it was growing with a lot of other maples. So the bigger it is, the bigger your root ball is going to be, the more work it's going to be. But you can transplant them that way. Again, I would recommend doing it bare root. If you can get, you get it out of the ground and then you get all the soil off of it and then cover those roots with wet newspaper or put them in wet mulch while you're moving them, because they will dry out and die very quickly. But that's going to be a lot, especially if it's a large specimen, that's going to be a lot easier to do than if it's a small tree. It also depends on the species. Hickories are notoriously difficult to transplant because they do develop a pretty significant taproot as seedlings that'll go down 2 or 3 feet, but then it doesn't get any bigger than that. But it can be a lot bigger than what you get on a lot of the other species. So you've got to dig deep to get those out of the ground. But yeah, I mean, everything that I talked about, because keep in mind, when you go and buy that tree at the nursery, you are also transplanting. So the same things apply. You just have to make sure that the root mass is enough to survive. If it's a bigger tree and you don't get a lot of the root mass, we know from experience those trees do well. That's what happens with Walden burlap. You just have to water them well.
So speaking of these little seedlings, how do you normally protect them? I found in my yard, a lot of them sort of disappeared, and I don't know if it was the deer or just let it dry out or whatever, but what do you do usually?
Usually if it sprouts from a seed, or if it's an oak or a hickory, it could be coming up from a significant root mass, because that's what they'll do is they'll sprout, they'll grow for 30 or 40 years, get to be maybe 15, 20 feet tall in the understory. But if they don't get an opening in the canopy that allows full sunlight to get down to them, they die, and then they sprout from the roots and try again. But usually where you see these you got lots of little seedlings in the spring and early summer, and then they disappear, it's an indication of deer browse. The way to protect them is to put a cage around them and keep the deer away from them. It could also be squirrels or other wildlife that's eating them. So you just need to keep the critters off, let them grow.
Is the cage,
or you can dig them up.
Was the cage better than a tree tube? Or do you use tree tubes on bare root seedlings?
I use on bare root seedlings that are not pines. We always, when I write a planting recommendation for a reforestation project, I always specify 4-foot tree tubes, and not all tree tubes are created equal. Some of them come flat and you got to bend them around and put a tab in a slot, and those things usually open it up, and once they open up, they're not doing you any good. So you need to get the kind that come shipped. They're fairly rigid because you need to get them into the ground a little bit, because one of the other things that'll eat those tree seedlings are voles. So they need to go about 1 inch to 2 inches into the ground to keep the voles off of them also. but we always use the tree tubes. They're easier to install than cages.
And so how does the tree get light?
Well, if you think about it, the leaves are green, tree tubes are green. So what's happening is those green tree tubes are allowing the other wavelengths of light to go through, which are the ones that the tree needs for photosynthesis.
Okay, well, that's amazing. And do you need to, how do you install them? Is this before you fill the hole back up with soil?
No, after you fill the hole, then you need to fix the tube down around it. And then usually what I do is I'll just take the blade of the shovel and I'll pound on it a little bit to get it seated down into the ground. It's helpful, but not completely necessary if you put the stake on the north side of the tube. That way you don't have the shade of the stake on the seedling.
I've always wondered. That's fantastic. One last question has come in. I have a less than first year scarlet oak. Do I need to protect it from cicadas this May and June?
I wouldn't worry too much about the cicadas on a small tree like that. They usually want to get a little higher in the canopy before they start laying eggs. So the young trees are pretty much immune. Now, for people who are planting 2 or 3 inch caliper trees, you might get some flagging at the top of the tree. But it's really very rare for the cicadas to, unless it's the only tree in a 5-acre field, you're usually not going to get enough damage to kill the tree, unless it's really, really stressed already.
Okay, well, that's good news. Another question then came in. How concerned should we be about protecting small, professionally planted red maples from dogs relieving themselves?
Depends on how frequently it happens. So there's a lot of nitrogen in urine, and the nitrogen you can get nitrogen burn. It's going to affect the way the tree grows if you put a lot of nitrogen on it. Particularly what will happen is that we see is when you give a good slug, and this applies more to lawn fertilizer than dog pee, but you give a good slug of nitrogen to a tree in the summer when it's supposed to be hardened off, it'll grow a new flush of twigs and leaves, which you might think would be a good thing, but there is, and the word escapes me, but there is a temporal relationship between when trees are putting out new leaves and their pests. And so those new leaves are going to have a lot of nitrogen and they're going to be unprotected. And so they're going to be attractive to pests that are able to see that. And you may get biomagnification of those pests because they're coming in and they're attacking those new twigs at the wrong time of year. So if you think about a caterpillar, if it's maybe a 1/2 inch long and a little tiny first instar when the leaves are vulnerable, but then the leaves harden off before it becomes a 3-inch caterpillar in its final instar just before it pupates, the leaves are going to be better able to protect themselves. In terms of the dog urine, it happens once or only a couple of times. It's probably not a problem. But if you've got neighborhood dogs that are putting gallons of urine on the same tree every day, that's going to lead to nitrogen burn, and it's going to be a problem for the tree. If you're trying to protect it, I never really thought about that, but I suppose, putting a small fence around the tree to keep the dog off of it, and putting up a sign asking dog walkers to not let their dog pee on the same tree every day is about all I can think of.
That's a good idea. because the dog walkers wouldn't know otherwise.
Right. Sit out on your front porch with a low-powered BB gun and
Slingshot.
shoot the dog walker, not the dog.
Okay. All right. I think we finished the questions. This has just been an amazing experience. Thank you, Jim, so much.
You're
I
welcome.
mean, I can't believe how many times I've heard you talk and how much I learn new every single time you do it. And this was a great example. So I'm so happy that we'll be able to put this recording up for other people to see.
Okay. Well, I get paid to do this 40 hours a week. So part of the issue is I keep learning more stuff as I pay attention to what's going on in the literature.
Well, thank you for learning it for us and transmitting it to us.
Okay.
All right. Well, great. And thank you all for participating and sending your questions. They were wonderful questions. So sign up for the next talk if you're interested. Goodbye, everybody.